Very pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. This is a great day. Not only is the temperature in a mildly acceptable range, but we also all got an extra hour of sleep. So above the masks, what I see are a bunch of bright eyes, and everyone's excited to be here. Everyone is energized. Everyone's excited, except for me. I can never sleep well on daylight savings time. For whatever reason, I'm always paranoid about the time change. So if anything, I'm probably more tired and more wired because of coffee this morning than I normally am. But regardless, it's good to be with each and every one of you. It's good to see so many people able to make it out with us. It's also good to see the Robertsons that are back with us after getting out of quarantine, being able to be with us. It's been several months since we've been able to see them. So it's great to see them. It's also great to see so many people that are here in the middle of what is an ultimately terrifying time period. 2020, as we've said 100 times this year, has not been anyone's best friend. It's not been anyone's dream, anticipation for the way this year was supposed to go. But we've all made it to this point. And so what I want you to do before we go any further, either physically or metaphorically, I want us all to take a collective deep breath and breathe it out. Because, ladies and gentlemen, on top of an otherwise hectic year, we have also made it to election week. And this week is the week that all of us have been putting our minds towards, at least in our spare time. We've heard just countless news stories. We've heard so much, back and forth from the different politicians. We've heard people arguing. We've seen two debates, not three as we normally do, one of which I wouldn't even really classify a debate. It was more like two kids screaming at each other. But it's not been the easiest election cycle. And even in the midst of all these presidential things, there's been accusations, there's been charges. And I'll just be honest with you, I don't remember a time period, at least in my relatively short life, that I can think of an election cycle that has been more contentious than this one. It feels like every 4 years we say the exact same thing. This has been the worst time period ever. This has been one of the hardest. But we, ladies and gentlemen, have finally made it to the week where we will elect a new president. And the next week, we'll be able to talk about something else. And as you go to the polls, whether you've already done early voting or whether you haven't, all of us are hopefully voting with our principles in mind. We're not just thinking about our pocketbooks. We're not just thinking about security and the world environment. We're also thinking about morals. We're thinking about which president we want to kind of lead our country in the way that it should go. As Clint read from us this morning from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, the prayer that we're supposed to utter towards people in charge is not just for peace and security, but also contentment in our life, that we can have the freedom to worship God in peace and sanctity. That's what some of our prayers should consist of this week. There's one verse, though, I think that kind of highlights where we're at as far as elections and Christians as people of God, and that's Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34, which says quite simply, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And like so many times you see the writer, we see Solomon in the book of Proverbs talking about, he talks about in terms of generalities. He obviously doesn't ever talk about a nation that is 100% right all the time. Even Israel had numerous failings all over the place. But when sin is present inside a nation, it brings a disgrace upon them. And you can see that inside of Israel. You can see that inside of Judah, ultimately resulting in their downfall. But what we want this week, what we ultimately want for the future of our country is peace. We want righteousness. We want a country that is headed in the right direction. But I'm going to switch gears on you here real quick. I do not believe that 100% of that responsibility lies in the decision that is made this Tuesday. I think most of the responsibility for the future of our nation, ladies and gentlemen, exists within the family units. I think when we talk about the future and where we're headed as a country, it isn't just about whether or not we're calling President Trump or whether we're calling President Joe Biden. It's not about the senators. It's not about the people that are in charge. It's about the family units. And what's interesting, too, is Ronald Reagan, who many people here love, who many people adore. I think Ronald Reagan was a fantastic president. He actually enacted a code back in the 80s that described the fundamental aspect of the family unit inside the country. These were just two of his executive orders, and I won't give you the number because I can't remember right now. I think it's 11208. But he enacted an executive order in the 80s that stated 7 different things. The first two go like this. Whenever there's going to be any kind of judicial legislation, any kind of senatorial legislation, what he wants them to do is ask the questions. Does this action by government strengthen or erode the stability of the family, and particularly the marital commitment? I think it's interesting that he wrapped the marital commitment on the back end of that. He also asked, does this action strengthen or erode the authority and the rights of parents in the education, nurture, and supervision of their children? There's 5 more that he talks about throughout this course of this executive order that have to do everything from education to finances to autonomy to the authority that the family unit has. But what Ronald Reagan understood is what every great politician at least should understand, is that the strength of the nation doesn't rest within the power of the government. It rests within the integrity of the nuclear family and whether or not parents are doing their job, whether or not kids are respectful, whether or not we're training our children, whether or not we're training our family in the way that it should go. And it doesn't always have to be the nuclear family. It can be grandparents with grandkids. It can be single people. It can be whoever you want. Whatever constitutes a family unit, is that unit headed towards God? And so with that in mind, I want to ask you a series of questions this morning that we can use to determine whether our own family unit is headed in the direction that we should. Number one, is my home a place where, number one, God is honored? All of you that are here this morning, hopefully, are here because you honor and because you value God. You would not be here this morning. You would not be partaking of the Lord's Supper this morning. You would not be singing songs. You would not be praying prayers. You would not be where you are right now if God is at least not honored a little bit in your life. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a huge difference between people who pay lip service towards God, people who talk about God and who kind of show up on Sunday mornings and Wednesday night and they read the Bible whenever they feel like it, and a home that is deliberately engineered towards honoring God. And this is a commandment that goes back to the beginning of time. If you look in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, for instance, Genesis chapter 18, starting in verse 16. It's right in the middle of what would be ultimately the erosion of the family unit, right in that story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham is talking to the angels, he's talking to the heavenly visitors. They're headed down towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis chapter 18, starting verse 16, it says, the men arose up from there, looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham is called the father of many nations for a very specific reason. Verse 19, for I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring up Abraham what he has spoken about him. And the Lord said, verse 20, the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great. Their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry which has come to me, and if not, I will know. When God is discussing Abraham, when he's talking about Abraham, he talks about him in the sense of somebody who was a father of many nations. But what he says in this passage is, I cannot withhold my intentions to Abraham because it is contingent on Abraham to teach what I'm about to do, and more importantly, why I'm about to do it, to other generations. In the entirety of the Old Testament, you never see a destruction that is quite on par with Sodom and Gomorrah. You can see other destructions, you can see other annihilations, but there's no other instance, at least in my opinion, my knowledge, where God rains fire and brimstone down from heaven to consume entire cities. And as if to exemplify this point, you also have that interesting exchange with Abraham where God says, I will not destroy it if there are 50 people. Not going to destroy it if there's 40 people. He gets all the way down to at least 10. I can't always remember if he gets to 10 or 5. But I am not going to destroy it if you can find 10 people amidst 2 cities of at least 10,000 people each. Because you can't find them, those 2 cities are annihilated. They're wiped off the map. But ladies and gentlemen, Sodom and Gomorrah didn't get to the standpoint that they're in. They didn't get to the situation that they're in overnight. You don't have a whole bunch of guys banging on the door of Lot's house in the evening time if you don't have other activities leading up to that. There's no honor of God inside of Sodom and Gomorrah, at the very least. The question I have, is there honor in my home? And one of the things that God says about Abraham is he is a person who is going to be responsible for teaching his kids not just to follow me, but also to honor me. And that's a responsibility that all of us take seriously. No matter what position you are inside the family unit, whether you're the leader, whether you're somebody else, you are responsible for creating an environment where God is honored. I want you to look at Exodus, the 13th chapter. Exodus chapter 13. There's a parallel with what we're reading here in Exodus 13, I think, very simply with the Lord's Supper, which we just did. And I really appreciate Curtis going through some of those things. I think it's good every once in a while to slow down and examine why we're taking the Lord's Supper and what the importance is. But I think you see something very similar to some of these rituals in the Old Testament of what you see in the New Testament with the Lord's Supper. Most importantly, understanding why we do these things. In Exodus chapter 13, starting in verse 11, it says, "Now when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and he gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord the first offspring of every womb, and the first offspring of every beast that you own. The males belong to the Lord. But every first offspring of a donkey you shall redeem with the lamb. But if you don't redeem it, you shall break its neck. And every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem." That seems kind of like an interesting discussion. This is what I want you to do. It seems very graphic. Look at verse 14. "It shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, 'What is this?' Then you shall say to him, 'With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And it came about when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sacrifice,'" notice the personal pronoun, "'I sacrifice to the Lord the males, the first offspring of every womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem.'" Notice this conversation that's taking place. Verse 11 through 13 is a very kind of regular stipulation about what you're supposed to do. You shall take the ox, you shall break its neck. This is the order of which it's going to go. But Moses adds something in verses 14 and 15. He anticipates the fact that at some point when you're engaged in this activity, your kids are going to look at you and wonder, what is it that we're doing here? Why did you break that ox's neck? I was going to eat that a little bit later. I had plans for that thing. Why'd you do that? What God says is you need to explain not just that we do it because God told us to, but because of what God did. I worry sometimes, and this is why I appreciate what Curtis did with the Lord's Supper, I worry sometimes that when we talk about the Lord's Supper to our kids, to other family members, to other people, the way that we describe it is we do it because we're commanded to do so. Nothing wrong with that argument. But why do we really partake of the Lord's Supper? We don't just partake of the Lord's Supper because we are commanded to. We don't just do it because we're looking to kill some space in between the songs and me getting up here and rambling at 400 miles an hour. We do it because we remember the sacrifice that God has. We remember the fact that he voluntarily gave his life on the cross for our sins, and because of that, we have that fellowship, that communion that was talked about. We do it because we're looking to honor God. But this extends, ladies and gentlemen, beyond the Lord's Supper. It extends beyond what we do in these four walls. It extends into our own homes. The way that we talk about God. The way that we talk about God's people. If we're raising our voices in song, and we're raising our voices in worship and in prayer, and we're taking the Lord's Supper, and we're doing everything right inside these four walls, and on the way home from the church building, we have fried elder and barbecue preacher for lunch, which you can persecute me all you want, I don't care. But if we have fried elder and barbecue preacher on the way home from lunch, what does that say to our family? What does that say to our kids? When we leave somewhere we're supposed to be in a state of reverence, and we talk about it openly like we would have rather been anywhere else besides that. What are our kids supposed to think when we talk about going to worship service on Wednesday night as an obligation instead of an opportunity? What do we think when we talk about the Bible class as being an optional activity? What are we communicating to our family members when that's the conversation that's taking place? Is my home a place where God is honored? Number two, is my home a place where purity reigns? As we talked about last week, there's no secret that this world just constantly seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And it seems like every generation talks about the current generation or future generations as having it 10 times harder than the past. You guys are just going to have it so much worse than we did. That may very well be true. But that doesn't change the fact that, as you can see from Genesis 18, the world has almost always been a pretty immoral place. And so it stands to reason that as our kids and as our family members go out into the world, they will undoubtedly encounter a whole bunch of people who don't believe the same way we do and don't act the same way that we do. But are we in a position as grandparents, as parents, as kids, as husbands and wives, are we crafting a home where purity takes preeminence? Where we're talking openly not just about the things that you shouldn't do, but about the things that you should do. You don't need to see the statistics in the world today to see that kids who are kids of alcoholic fathers are more prone to alcoholism in their life. People who grow up in abusive environments tend to have less respect for other people and then kind of keep that abusive behavior moving. And how we impact our kids and what type of environment we have in our lives will dictate what future generations have. I want you to look at 1 Kings, the 2nd chapter. One of the things that's always been interesting to me is you look at some of these quote-unquote great people of Scripture, and there are, I use that term very seriously, but also as kind of an arbitrary standpoint at various times. In 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1, as David is on his deathbed and he's talking to his son Solomon, who will eventually become king, and we all know exactly what Solomon ended up becoming. He was somebody who not only had a lot of women in his life, but he's somebody who also ran out Jeroboam of the country as fast as he could. But at this point in time, when David is talking to Solomon, he gives him a number of instructions that I think are worth passing down. In 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1, it says, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Which, by the way, Paul would say much the same thing to the letter of the Corinthians, or to the church at Corinth. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful to walk in their way, to walk before me in truth, with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. You know what's interesting to me about this conversation? Which, by the way, if you pick up in verses 5 and go through verse 9, you can see David switching the narrative a little bit and talking about all the things he wants Solomon to do to people. But when you look at these first 4 verses, what David doesn't say to Solomon is probably some things that would have done him some good. In other words, don't marry 700 women. That should just go without saying. I didn't say that at all. What he did say in 1 Kings chapter 2 was, follow the Lord. Follow God. Seek his commandments. Seek his ordinances. And it seems like a really subtle switch, but I think it's a marked departure from the way that sometimes we talk about life with our kids, with our grandkids, with our friends, when we always put things in context of don't do this, don't go there, don't touch that, don't view this, don't be friends with that person. What if we switch the narrative? And instead of talking about things they should not do, we said follow after God. Seek his commandments. Study his word. Make him a part of your life. Look towards him for everything. What if we switch the conversation from being about all the things that you shouldn't do to all the things that you should do? I think the family dynamic would shift remarkably if that were the case. In Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1. The very beginning of this fantastic book. Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, to know wisdom and to instruction, to discern the sayings of understandings, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth, knowledge and discretion. A wise man, verse 5, will hear and will increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and the riddles. I don't know what riddle is, that's not even a word. The fear of the Lord, ladies and gentlemen, verse 7, is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. The beginning of any conversation we need to have with our kids in terms of a spiritual nature should begin with the fear of the Lord. When we talk about what people do and what they should do and where they should go and the attitudes and the habits they should form in their life, it should always come back to the way that those things intersect with God. When we talk about these types of activities or those types of values, are we describing in terms of purity? Or are we just giving them a list of instructions that they should avoid at all costs? We need to be planting inside our family members not just tripwires, but we need to be planting in them goals to achieve, spiritual aspirations that they can acquire throughout their life. Number 3, is my home a place where prayer is encouraged? You may find this hard to believe, or maybe not, depending on how you view me, but for me, praying in public is one of the most uncomfortable things that I ever do. And part of the job is when you go other places, you get asked to pray, I almost always turn it down because it's very hard for me to do. Prayer for me is very personal. I'm terrible for a whole lot of reasons at doing public prayer because I have a hard time knowing what the needs are of the church, but prayer for me is very personal. I have a hard time doing it in public. That being said, prayer in my home should be encouraged on a daily, if not a regular basis inside the house. And I'm not just talking about at meals. I'm not just talking about before we go to bed at night. I'm not just talking about these little times that it seems almost ordinary to do it. Almost a ready state of mind, as we talked about a few weeks ago with these ideas of 10-second prayers, where every single time we need something, every single time we're thankful for something, every single time we're struggling with something, we reach out towards God in prayer. Is my home a place where prayer is not looked at as a sign of weakness, but something that we do as we draw closer and closer towards God. Prayer, ultimately, as we think about its usefulness, prayer shows a recognition of who God is. Prayer shows a desire to do more good. Help me to do these types of things. Prayer shows a desire to do good only if it is in God's will. And prayer shows a dependency on God for every single thing. As you think about prayer in everyday life, and especially in my home, it's not just about fostering a relationship with God. It's not just keeping that line of communication constantly open so that we can go to Him with every concern and with every sense of gratitude. That's not the main point of prayer, the only point of prayer, rather. One of the other points of prayer is so that we learn to develop godly habits. So that we learn when we examine situations, we don't just view them through a physical lens, but we view them through a spiritual lens. How does this please God? How does this not please God? If I were talking to God right now about my actions, what would I say? That thought I just had, how would I explain that to God? Encouragement in prayer as a daily basis in your home is not just about keeping that communication, it's also about developing that godly mindset. And there's a difference between just having a home where prayer is done to a home where prayer is encouraged. Next time your kids, your grandkids, your spouse comes to you and says, I'm really struggling with this, ask them the question, have you prayed about it? Have you gone to God with that prayer in your life? Look in Psalm 5. Psalm 5. If you're looking for a great rubric for prayer, I found this one in Psalm 5. I think it's phenomenal. The 5th Psalm. Verse 1, he says, Give ear to my words, O Lord, and consider my groaning. Heed the sound of my cry for help, my King and my God, for to you I pray. In the morning you will hear my voice, and in the morning I will order my prayer to you and eagerly watch. For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all who do iniquity. You destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the man of bloodshed and deceits. But as for me, by your abundant loving kindness I will enter your house, and at your holy temple I will bow in reverence for you. O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes, and make your way straight before me, for there is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Hold them guilty, O God. By their own devices let them fall. In the multitude of their transgressions thrust them out, for they are rebellious against you. But let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy, and may you shelter them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For it is you who blesses the righteous man, O Lord. You'll surround him with favor, as with a shield. Is that a prayer that I'm capable of praying today? Is that a prayer that if I were to pray it would define my life? Am I somebody who desperately wants that righteousness in my life? Am I somebody who wants God's leading hand in my life? And do I want it on my family? Prayer should be an everyday thing. It should be an every hour thing. It should be an every minute thing. It should be a constant state of mind in our life. And it should be something that we encourage inside our household, especially in a time period like right now where it seems like everything's going haywire. Number 4, is my home a place? That was my big moment. I missed it. Is my home a place where sin is disciplined? I'm going to tell you something right now, and this is something that I wouldn't have known a few years ago. But there's a difference between my kids obeying my rules and my kids obeying God's rules. In my home, I can have rules like you have to go to bed by 7:30, you have to pick up your room, you have to make sure you eat all your broccoli, you have to eat at least half of your soup because your mother made it and it's fantastic. Those are my rules. But there's a difference between my kids obeying my rules and my kids obeying God's rules. And hopefully those are the same in a whole bunch of ways. But there's a difference between our kids enjoying those rules and obeying the other rules. Because the truth of the matter is that regardless of how our parenting is inside our home, God will discipline everybody someday. And if we're creating an environment where kids are able to run freely, where there's no accountability between spouses, if we're creating an environment where the family doesn't even communicate, where they don't even talk, there's no responsibility for me to my wife or my wife to me, then ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to answer to God for that. Because God's going to look at me. And he's going to say, why is it that you treated your wife that way? I think it's very interesting that in the book of Malachi, in chapter 2 and verse 17, right in that momentous phrase where God says, I hate divorce, says it plain as day, he also says, I hate those who cover their garment with wrongs. Those who have caused the wife of their youth to be in tears daily because of mistreatment, because of abuse. I hate divorce. But I also hate marriages where people abuse each other all the time. What I want, God says essentially, is that marital unit to be in harmony with each other, with love to be present there as well. Is my home a place where sin is disciplined? Maybe not in a corporate sense, but is my home a place where accountability matters between family members? When you look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, we talked a second ago about David. And David, as I forgot to mention then, but David is not always the best dad. And I think that's interesting when you look, as we mentioned, some of these great individuals in the kingdom. They weren't exactly the most stellar parents. And David, for all of his greatness and for all the things that he did fantastic, he wasn't exactly the best person at wrangling in his kids, most of which killed the other kids. But in 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 22, you have one of the greatest figures, at least of this book, talking about Eli, whose kids are an abomination towards them. And what's worse than calling your kids an abomination is calling you responsible for their abominations. And that's exactly what God does to him. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting verse 22, it says, Now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to Israel, how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And he said to them, Why do you do such things, the evil things I hear from all these people? No, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they wouldn't listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor both with the Lord and with men. And a man of God came to Eli and said to him, Thus says the Lord, Did I not indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, or in bondage in Egypt to Pharaoh's house? Did I not choose them from all the tribes of Israel to be my priests, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to carry an ephod before me? And did I not give to the house of your father all the fire offerings of the sons of Israel? Why then, verse 29, do you kick at my sacrifice and at my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me, by making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord God of Israel declares, I did indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever, but now the Lord declares, Far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming, verse 31, when I will break your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. You will see the distress of my dwelling in spite of all the good that I do for Israel, and an old man will not be in your house forever. Do you notice what God is saying to these people? When God is talking to Eli, and Eli obviously is reprimanding his sons in the early part of that, but those kids don't care what their dad says. They do whatever they want to. They do whatever they feel like it. They take advantage of the priesthood. They operate however they want to. And what God says to Eli is, You have elevated your sons above me. That's the worst thing that God can say to any parent about their kid. You have elevated your kids above me. It's important for me to have my kids obey my rules. I enjoy having them in bed at 7 o'clock every single night. I really love that. But it's more important to me to have my kids listen to God, to have my family members that care more about God than they do about me. Because at the end of time, it's not going to matter whether or not they were in bed at 7. It may matter, and if that's on Judgment Day, I'll be very surprised. But what will matter is whether or not they're obedient to God. And obedience to God, ladies and gentlemen, begins with obedience to parents. Accountability towards God begins with accountability between family members. Love towards God begins with the love that you have for your spouse, for your family. That's why the family is so important. I love what Omar Bradley said. He's one of the most famous generals, at least of the 20th century. And he said, we have grasped, talking about as a nation, he said, we have grasped the mystery of the atom, and we've rejected the Sermon on the Mount. The world has achieved brilliance without conscience. Ours is a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. There's been a lot of emphasis over the last 6 months put into how we're going to vote on Tuesday. And if you've already voted, great for you. I already have. I'm sure most people here have as well. 75 million Americans have. That's great. There's a lot of emphasis onto what's going to happen on Tuesday night. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of angst put on that moment to decide in their minds where the future of America is going to go. Let me tell you right now, the battle for America's soul is not fought Tuesday nights. The battle for America's soul is happening every single day in thousands of homes around the world and around the country. as we seek and ask ourselves, are we going to follow God? Or are we going to do whatever we want to? That's where the soul of America is won, is in your home today, tomorrow, and for the rest of time. And if you're here this morning and for some reason you haven't put on Christ through waters of baptism, I would strongly encourage you, if for no other reason, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to be like, to make that calling and election sure. Your kids will see it. Your family will see it. And they'll take strength from that as they try to draw closer to God as well. Whatever your need is, I would encourage you, make it known as we stand, as we